On the afternoon it happened, the bells began a shade earlier than they ought, a scattered clatter when St. Mary Mead expected a practiced pattern. Miss Marple, sitting by her cottage window with a length of pale blue wool lying neatly in her lap, lifted her head at once. The sound had a sag in it, as though a voice had cracked on a note it knew very well. She had a fondness for bells, their tidy logic, their friendly boasting, and the village had taken pride these last months in learning real change-ringing under Mr. Arthur Whitmore's stern leadership. He was a precise, taut man with a mustache like a line ruled across his face, and he kept his ringers to time with the exactitude of a parade sergeant. That was why the falter mattered. She set her knitting aside without hurry and went to the gate. The lane wore its March damp. The hedges breathed green, and the sky promised no more rain. The sound from the tower changed again, a flurry of notes tumbling over one another, then a jar, as if a hand had slipped from a rope. Silence followed, in which she distinctly heard a single cry and something like a wooden thud. Silence again, the unnerving quiet of something having gone wrong. By the time she reached the churchyard, there were figures coming and going at the porch with the ill coherence of alarm. Mr. Pierce, the verger, had his keys out and was jangling them uselessly. He kept glancing up at the square tower as if the bells themselves might answer. Elsie Banbury, the grocer's daughter and a new ringer, was white to the lips. Tom Pritchard, with flour on his sleeve from the bakehouse, had his jaw set in that dangerous way of men who prefer action to sense. The vicar came hurrying from the vestry, his cassock tucked up at the knees. A little knot of old women clung together by the yews and made soft exclamations, because that is what old women do when something dreadful is in the air and there is nothing else to be done about it. "Keep back, if you please," Mr. Pierce said, finding his authority at last. "There's been, well, best keep back." Miss Marple did not press forward. She stepped aside into the cool shade near the porch and waited. Waiting is underrated. It is during the waiting that people talk too much and that the smallest things can be seen. Elsie was trembling in the wrists. Her right glove was still clutched in her left hand, and there was a smear of grey on the kid, the marked chalk leaves when fingers absent-mindedly rub it away. Tom Pritchard had a red ribbon peeping from his pocket, 2 inches of it, slightly frayed. An oddity for a baker, unless one knew that the bell ropes had such ribbons tied to distinguish them for beginners. The vicar's spectacles were misted. He had run. The verger came back down the narrow stair, his face a waxy color. "Send for Dr. Haydock," he said into the hush. "And Mr. Slack must be told. It's Mr. Whitmore. He's fallen." They fetched Dr. Haydock from his rounds sooner than was perhaps safe, and Inspector Slack would be fetched whether anyone asked for him or not. Miss Marple slipped under the cover of general distress into the nave and then toward the foot of the tower stairs. It is astonishing where an elderly woman may wander in a church without being stopped. The stair door stood open. The stone steps, worn in the middle by centuries of feet, spiraled up into a dimness that smelled of dust and rope hemp. On the third tread there was a single crushed primrose, a damp earth still clinging to its stem. That suggested a visit to the hedge bank beside the lich gate. A simple enough stop on the way in, but odd for a man as punctual as Arthur Whitmore, who disliked delays of any kind. They had laid him at the foot of the steps and drawn aside. Tom Pritchard stood back, grey-faced. Elsie had both hands to her mouth. Mr. Whitmore lay a little awkwardly, as the fallen often do, one leg under him and one arm flung out, palm up. He had hit the edge of a step on the way down. There was a bruise beginning to show above his ear, and a darker patch under his hat brim. His watch had come free from its chain and lay cracked beside him, hand stopped at 8 minutes to 4. The glass starred like ice. His mustache was still stern. The expression on his face had that startling surprise of the newly dead. Dr. Haydock, bustling in with his bag and his familiar dry concern, knelt. He touched here, examined there. "Neck likely broken," he said. That's a hard stair. Poor devil. His eyes, clever and kind, went around the circle. No one moved him. No, the vicar said, smoothing his cassock unnecessarily. There was such a noise, and then nothing, and then Elsie screamed. Tom and Mr. Pierce ran up, and Tom shouted down that Arthur had fallen. We did not touch him. He swallowed. We could not. Miss Marple stood with her hands folded. The rope ends swayed faintly above in the ringing chamber, visible through the cutaway of the ceiling where the staircase opened. One rope had a darker mark just above the sally, the soft, tufted grip, like grease or tallow. There was a smell that did not wholly belong in the tower. Lavender, but very light, the kind some ladies use in their ironing water. On the stone not far from Mr. Whitmore's hand, a small round object winked unnoticed until the verger's foot almost crushed it. Miss Marple bent with some effort and retrieved it, turning it in her fingers. It was a tiny brass button stamped with an anchor, the sort one sees on a peacoat or a nautical blazer. She did not pocket it. A respectable old lady does not pilfer in church, but she held it thoughtfully, then set it on the sill by the door where it would be safe from clumsy shoes. Miss Banbury, she said after a moment, in the tone one uses for children and upset young women. Will you sit down a little? Your hand is shaking. Elsie lowered her hands as if she had been instructed at school and looked at the glove she still held. He said I was counting wrong, she blurted. We were trying the touches Mr. Whitmore wrote on the blackboard. Plain Bob. We had it last week. Only today he was very particular. And then he sent me down to fetch the chalk. I hadn't moved it, miss. I swear, I hadn't touched it. Her eyes went to the doorway as if the chalk might appear and exonerate her. Who else was up? Dr. Haydock asked, practical as ever. Tom and Ted Barton and Mr. Whitmore, the verger said. And Harry Coombs came late and was in the porch when... He lifted his hands, helplessly. I always bolt the stair after we go up, but Mr. Whitmore had me leave it on the latch today, on account of the draft. Odd, Miss Marple murmured. Arthur Whitmore did not like people coming and going. He was particular about doors. He was particular about everything. Inspector Slack arrived with his big coat flapping and an air of general disapproval that suited him. He tipped his hat to Miss Marple and looked around with narrowed eyes, as if the church had erred in existing. All right, he said shortly. No one leaves. Names. He took in Mr. Whitmore with a brisk nod and glanced at the stair. Clear accident, is it? He tripped? Possibly, Dr. Haydock said. It will be for the inquest. He has a nasty bruise here. He gestured. Might be from the step. Might be otherwise. Slack grunted. His gaze went to the ropes, then to the smudged sally. What's that? Tallow, Mr. Pierce said quickly. We sometimes... He stopped. Well, not on that rope, sir. Not today. Miss Marple's eyes, moving as if of their own accord, found the blackboard in the ringing chamber visible beyond the stairwell. The chalked figures had been wiped with a wet cloth in a hurry. There were little tails at the ends of the numbers where the moisture dragged. That would make sense if there had been an argument, and someone petulantly erased the practice. There was a damp sponge thrown carelessly on the ledge. A drop made a dark spot on the stone. Mr. Whitmore had words this morning with Ted Barton at the shop, someone said behind Miss Marple, about the peal for Mrs. Frobisher's wedding. He said Ted didn't keep time. Ted said Mr. Whitmore had his head so full of London ways he'd forgot village folk can't all count to 10 the same way. That is unkind, Miss Marple said mildly. But people are often unkind when they are flustered. She looked down once more at the crushed primrose on the stair. She remembered, as she remembered everything insignificant, that Arthur Whitmore did not pick flowers. He considered it untidy. Yet someone had brought primroses into the tower and crushed one underfoot in haste. The sound of the bells had left an echoing quality in the stones. A draught moved somewhere above and set the ropes to a lazy sway. Miss Marple put out one finger and stopped the rope marked with the tallow smear. The scent of lavender rose again, fainter now that the door stood open. and the March air, came in. She thought of Elsie's glove with its chalk smear, Mr. Pierce's protestations about bolts and latches, Tom Pritchard's bit of ribbon, and the anchor on the tiny button, left like a dropped breadcrumb on the sill. These were not yet facts, only little domestic observations, the sort that would sit comfortably in her mind until they found a place to belong. She stepped back and folded her hands and listened while Inspector Slack asked his questions in his brisk way, and while the vicar wrote names in an earnest list he would later mislay. The tower breathed that faint, wrong lavender, and the stopped watch face glittered with the last of the afternoon light, and very quietly in Miss Marple's head something clicked into alertness, the way a stitch will catch when a knitter feels without seeing that the pattern has been disturbed. The morning after Arthur Whitmore's death arrived with the sort of persistent drizzle that seems to press secrets closer to the surface, and Inspector Slack returned to St. Mary's with the brisk efficiency of a man determined to close a simple case quickly. He had spent the night reviewing his notes and had convinced himself that accidents, however inconvenient, remained more common than murder in villages like St. Mary Mead. Yet something in the careful way the witnesses had arranged themselves in the vestry suggested that the matter might not prove quite so straightforward as he preferred. "Right then," Slack announced, settling his considerable frame behind the vestry table like a magistrate preparing for court. "We'll have this sorted before lunch. Dr. Haydocks confirmed the cause of death. Broken neck, head trauma, consistent with a fall down stone steps. The watch stopped at 8 minutes to 4, which matches your accounts of when the accident occurred." He looked around the assembled group with the satisfaction of a man stating obvious facts. "Simple enough. Man loses his footing, takes a tumble, breaks his neck. Happens more often than you'd think." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window where the grey light fell across her knitting, observed that Inspector Slack's certainty had the brittle quality of ice that appears solid, but cracks under the slightest pressure. She had spent the early morning walking through the village, and the small inconsistencies that had troubled her yesterday had multiplied like weeds after rain. Tom Pritchard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his flour-dusted hands working at his cap. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but it wasn't quite so simple as all that. Arthur was particular about those stairs. He'd been up and down them hundreds of times, knew every worn spot and loose stone, and he was in a right state yesterday, angrier than I'd seen him in months." "Angry about what?" Slack's pencil hovered over his notebook. "The practice wasn't going well," Elsie Banbury said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Whitmore kept changing the method on the blackboard. He'd write it out, then rub it clean and start again. Said we were making a dog's dinner of it, that we'd shame the church if we couldn't manage something so elementary." Her gloved hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple noticed that the chalk smear from yesterday had spread, as if the girl had been worrying at it all night. Ted Barton, who had been summoned back despite his obvious reluctance, cleared his throat roughly. Arthur had been getting harder to please lately, more critical, more demanding. Used to be he'd work with you if you were struggling. Past few weeks, he'd just get that pinched look and make you feel like a fool. His eyes avoided everyone else's gaze. Yesterday he was worse than usual. Kept going on about the wedding peal for young Mrs. Frobisher. Said we'd embarrass ourselves if we couldn't manage proper change ringing. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked a particularly intricate pattern. "You mentioned that Mr. Whitmore sent Miss Banbury down for fresh chalk. Was there something wrong with what you had?" Elsie's face flushed. "He said the piece was too stubby, too crumbled to write properly. But when I went to the vestry drawer where Mr. Pierce keeps the chalk for the hymn numbers, it wasn't there. I looked in the vicar's desk and then in the cupboard, but I couldn't find any." She paused, confusion clouding her features. "In the end, Tom had a piece in his pocket, so we used that. But you said yesterday that you hadn't touched the original chalk," Miss Marple observed gently. "If you hadn't handled it, how did you know it was too stubby for Mr. Whitmore's liking?" The silence that followed had weight to it. Elsie's mouth opened and closed without sound, and Tom Pritchard's face went the color of old dough. Even Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with the expression of a man who had just heard his simple case develop complications. That is, Elsie stammered, then stopped altogether. Harry Coombs, who had been sitting quietly in the corner like a man hoping to be forgotten, suddenly spoke up. "She went up earlier, didn't you, Elsie? Before practice started proper. I saw you coming down the stairs when I arrived. You looked upset." "That's right," Ted said slowly, memory apparently returning. "You came up while Arthur and I were setting the ropes. Arthur sent you away, said it wasn't your place to be there before practice time." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Elsie with the gentle attention she might give to a nervous sparrow. "What did you see up there, my dear? Something troubled you, I think." Elsie's composure crumbled like the chalk she had been sent to find. "There was someone else there," she whispered, "in the ringing chamber. I heard voices, Mr. Whitmore's and someone else's. They were having words, quiet-like but angry. When I came up the stairs, the other person was just leaving, going down the back way that leads to the vestry. I only saw them from behind, but they were in a hurry." Inspector Slack's pencil snapped against his notebook. "Why didn't you mention this yesterday?" "I wasn't sure I should. Mr. Whitmore saw me and was cross that I'd come up early. He said I was to go away and not come back until proper practice time. I thought perhaps I'd misunderstood what I'd seen." Miss Marple retrieved the small brass button from her reticule, where she had carefully preserved it overnight. "Was this person wearing a navy coat, by any chance? Something with brass buttons?" Elsie stared at the button as if it might bite her. I think so. Yes, it might have been." The vestry seemed to grow smaller as the implications settled over the assembled group. Miss Marple thought of her morning walk, of the conversations she had had with Mrs. Clement at the vicarage and Mrs. Dane at the post office. Arthur Whitmore had been expecting someone yesterday afternoon, someone whose visit had pleased him enough to mention. He had posted a letter to his sister with unusual urgency, asking particularly about the afternoon collection, and he had, most uncharacteristically, asked for the tower door to be left unbolted. "Mr. Pierce," she said to the verger, who had been growing paler with each revelation, "you mentioned yesterday that Mr. Whitmore asked for the door to be left on the latch because of a delivery. Did such a delivery arrive?" "No, Miss Marple. No delivery came. I would have seen it." Mr. Pierce's voice had developed a tremor. "But now that I think on it, there was someone asking after Mr. Whitmore earlier in the week. A stranger, well-dressed, with a London accent. Said they had business to discuss. I told them about practice times when they might find him at the church." Inspector Slack had abandoned his simple accident theory with the reluctant air of a man forced to acknowledge that the weather had changed. Description of this stranger: middle-aged, I'd say. Wearing a good coat, navy blue with brass buttons. Carried a walking stick and had the look of someone used to being listened to. Mr. Pierce paused, then added reluctantly, "They asked particularly about whether Mr. Whitmore lived alone, whether he had family nearby." Miss Marple's knitting needles had gone still in her hands. She thought of the crushed primrose on the third step, the faint scent of lavender that had seemed so out of place, the grease mark on the rope that would make a grip treacherous. She thought of Arthur Whitmore's watch, stopped at exactly 8 minutes to 4, and of how a man expecting an important visitor might begin practice early, might leave doors unbolted, might send his students away when that visitor arrived unexpectedly. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we may need to reconsider the nature of Mr. Whitmore's fall. Accidents, as you say, do happen, but so do meetings that go badly wrong, and so do arguments that end in violence. The question now is not whether Mr. Whitmore fell, but whether he fell alone." The drizzle continued against the vestry windows, and somewhere in the tower above, the ropes swayed gently in the draught, keeping time with secrets that had yet to be told. Inspector Slack, having abandoned his simple accident theory with the reluctant air of a man forced to acknowledge that the weather had changed, decided that Arthur Whitmore's cottage might yield more cooperative answers than the village witnesses. The morning drizzle had given way to a sharp wind that rattled windows and set gates to creaking, and Miss Marple found herself walking beside the inspector down the narrow path to the bell ringer's dwelling, her umbrella clutched firmly against the gusts. The cottage crouched beneath its thatch with the unremarkable dignity of village dwellings that have sheltered generations of careful lives. Mr. Pierce had provided the key with obvious reluctance, as if unlocking a dead man's door might disturb more than dust. Inside, Arthur Whitmore's domestic arrangements bore the same precision as his bell ringing. Books stood in exact rows, their spines aligned with military precision. A small writing desk occupied the window alcove, its surface clear except for a leather blotter, an inkwell, and a wooden tray holding 3 pencils sharpened to identical points. "Tidy man," Slack observed, and Miss Marple nodded, though her attention had already caught on details that spoke of recent disturbance beneath the surface order. The leather blotter bore the faint impression of writing, visible when the light struck it properly, and there were small scratches in the wax seal of the inkwell, as if it had been opened and closed repeatedly in recent days. Inspector Slack's methodical search of the writing desk yielded an unsealed letter addressed to Miss Margaret Whitmore in Bournemouth. His eyebrows rose as he read aloud. "My dear Margaret, I find myself in need of your advice regarding a matter of some delicacy. A person from my past has made contact, someone I had not expected to see again. They claim to have information that would be of mutual benefit, but I confess I am uncertain of their motives. If something should happen to me, I want you to know that the papers I mentioned are hidden behind the loose brick in the kitchen hearth, 3rd from the left on the bottom row." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring that came when scattered pieces began to suggest a pattern. He never sent it, which means either he decided against confiding in his sister, or events moved too quickly for him to reconsider. The kitchen hearth yielded its secrets reluctantly. The 3rd brick from the left in the bottom row had been recently disturbed. Fresh scratches in the mortar and a small pile of dust on the floor suggesting multiple recent removals. Behind it lay a metal document box wrapped in oiled cloth, containing papers that told a story neither of them had expected. Military records showed that Arthur Whitmore had served as a quartermaster sergeant during the war, stationed at a supply depot in Kent. Among the official documents were carbon copies of reports detailing systematic theft on a considerable scale. Rifles missing from shipments, ammunition counts that failed to match delivery receipts, medical supplies that vanished between depot and destination. The reports, written in Arthur's precise hand, were addressed to his commanding officer, Major Hamilton, and painted a picture of corruption that had diverted thousands of pounds worth of military supplies from their intended destinations. At the bottom of the box lay a photograph showing Arthur in uniform with 3 other men beside a military truck. One face had been carefully circled in pencil, and on the back Arthur had written J.H. Bournemouth, 1947 in his methodical script. Between the pages of a prayer book in the bedroom, they found a recent newspaper clipping, "Bournemouth businessman honored for charitable works." The photograph showed the same man, older and more distinguished, identified as Mr. James Hamilton, proprietor of Hamilton and Associates, a successful import business. The same initials, Miss Marple noted quietly. And Bournemouth, just as Arthur wrote on the photograph. It seems Mr. Hamilton has done quite well for himself since the war. The most revealing discovery came from beneath Arthur's mattress. A leather portfolio containing correspondence with London solicitors, papers relating to the establishment of a trust fund, and a draft letter to the War Office requesting that certain wartime investigations be reopened. Arthur Whitmore had not been content to let sleeping dogs lie. The final document was a bank statement showing a deposit of £500 dated yesterday, with a notation in Arthur's hand. First payment, conscience money. More to follow if silence maintained. Miss Marple set down the papers with careful precision. It appears that Mr. Hamilton came not to silence Arthur, but to buy his silence. Arthur took the first payment, but I suspect he had no intention of staying bought. A man who keeps such meticulous records of wrongdoing is not easily corrupted. As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where primroses bloomed along the path. She thought of the crushed flower on the church stair, of the faint scent of lavender that had seemed so out of place in the tower, of the grease mark on the rope that would make a grip treacherous. The brass button in her reticules seemed to grow heavier with significance. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we need to consider that Mr. Hamilton may not have been the only visitor to the tower yesterday. Arthur was expecting him, yes, but someone else may have discovered their meeting. Someone who knew about Arthur's past, who understood the value of what he possessed." The wind continued to rattle the cottage windows, and in its moaning voice, Miss Marple heard the echo of old sins coming home to roost. Arthur Whitmore had died not because he was greedy, but because he was honest. In a world where successful men could bury their past mistakes beneath layers of respectability and charitable works, his stubborn integrity had made him dangerous. The question now was whether James Hamilton had killed to protect his reputation, or whether someone else had discovered the secret that Arthur had guarded so carefully, and decided that neither man should profit from it. The pattern was beginning to emerge from the scattered threads of evidence, like a design slowly revealing itself in careful stitches. But Miss Marple knew that the most important threads were often the smallest ones, the details that seemed insignificant until they proved to be the very foundation upon which the whole truth rested. The morning after their discoveries at Arthur Whitmore's cottage brought Inspector Slack to the uncomfortable realization that his investigation had evolved from a simple accident inquiry into something considerably more complex. The evidence of wartime corruption and recent blackmail payments had transformed the bell ringer's death into a puzzle with pieces that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. Miss Marple, arriving at the police station with her knitting bag and an air of quiet purpose, suggested they begin with the most reliable witnesses in any village mystery, the shopkeepers who notice everything and forget nothing. Mrs. Dane at the post office received them with the barely contained excitement of someone who had been holding important information and was finally being asked to share it properly. Her ledger lay open on the counter, and she consulted it with the solemnity of a court clerk reading evidence. "2 telephone calls for Mr. Whitmore yesterday," she announced, adjusting her spectacles. "The first came at 2:30. A London exchange, though the caller wouldn't leave his name, said he'd ring back. The second was at 3:15, and this time the gentleman gave his name as Mr. Hamilton, calling from Bournemouth. The line was poor with all the weather we've been having, but I could hear Mr. Whitmore's voice change when he took the call in the box. Quite pleased he sounded, almost relieved. When he came out, he checked his watch and said to me, 'That will do very well, Mrs. Dane. Everything's falling into place.'" Inspector Slack made careful notes, while Miss Marple observed that Arthur Whitmore had not sounded like a man being blackmailed, but rather like someone whose plans were proceeding satisfactorily. Mrs. Dane continued with the methodical precision of someone who prided herself on noticing details. "And there was a gentleman in earlier, asking directions to the church. Well-dressed, London voice, navy coat with brass buttons, though I noticed one was missing from the front. Left a bit of thread hanging. He bought cigarettes and stamps, paid with a crisp £5 note. His hands were well kept, but the nails were bitten down to the quick, which seemed odd for such a polished gentleman. And he had a scent about him, lavender, but not the sort ladies use, more refined, like cologne." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "Did he seem nervous, Mrs. Dane?" "Restless, I'd say. Kept checking his watch and glancing toward the church, asked whether the bell practice drew many people, whether folks came and went from the tower regularly. I told him Mr. Whitmore ran a tight ship and didn't care for interruptions." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "He left just after 3, walking toward the church with that purposeful stride city men have when they're late for appointments." Their next stop was the bank, where Mr. Larch received them in his private office with the cautious courtesy of a man whose profession required discretion, but whose curiosity had been thoroughly aroused. The metallic scent of the safe and the orderly arrangement of ledgers seemed to calm Inspector Slack's growing frustration with the case's complications. Mr. Whitmore's deposit yesterday was indeed £500 in cash, Mr. Larch confirmed, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. New notes, sequential numbers, the sort one receives from a London bank. He seemed quite particular about the receipt, asked me to note the time and date precisely. But what struck me was that he wasn't alone. Slack's pencil stopped moving across his notebook. Not alone? A gentleman waited near the door, hat pulled low, hands kept gloved despite the mild weather. Navy coat with brass buttons, though I noticed one was missing. There was a loose thread where it had been. He didn't approach the counter, but he watched everything Mr. Whitmore did with considerable interest. When I asked if I could assist him, he declined politely and said he was simply waiting for his friend. Miss Marple withdrew the newspaper clipping of James Hamilton from her reticule and placed it on Mr. Larch's desk. "Would you say this gentleman resembled the man who waited?" Mr. Larch studied the photograph carefully, then nodded slowly. The same, or very like, though the man in my bank seemed more tense, if I may say so. He asked me whether our village enjoyed many visitors from London, whether business dealings here remained confidential. I assured him that discretion was our watchword, but his question struck me as odd. The Blue Boar Inn provided the next piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Bartlett, the proprietress, consulted her guest register with obvious pride in her establishment's reputation for comfort and discretion. Room 3 was taken yesterday by a Mr. Jenkins. Said he might stay the night, but left his key and departed before supper. Tall gentleman, London hat, well-tailored coat with those naval buttons. Very polite, ordered tea and wrote several letters at the writing desk. Paid in cash and left no forwarding address. She paused, then added with the air of someone sharing a professional observation. He used lavender water, the expensive kind. My Maggie found a handkerchief in the room with just a touch of the scent. Gentleman's cologne, not the sort ladies favor. Inspector Slack requested to examine the room, and Mrs. Bartlett led them upstairs with evident curiosity. Room 3 retained the slightly unsettled atmosphere of recent occupancy, as if the furniture itself remembered its temporary inhabitant. Miss Marple moved through the space with the careful attention of someone reading a story written in small details. The writing desk bore the impression of firm handwriting on the blotting paper, and when held to the light, fragments of words emerged, Hamilton and Associates, and what appeared to be the beginning of an address. A small splinter near the chair suggested someone had been agitated enough to dig their nails into the wood, and the faint scent of lavender lingered despite the open window. Maggie mentioned a brass button, Mrs. Bartlett added helpfully. Fell from his coat when he hung it up. She meant to return it, but forgot in the rush of service. When she remembered, it had disappeared, probably rolled under the furniture somewhere. Miss Marple touched the brass button in her reticule, feeling its weight like a small anchor to the truth. The evidence was building a clear picture. James Hamilton had indeed come to St. Mary Mead, had waited while Arthur Whitmore deposited the money, and had taken lodging under a false name. But the timing suggested something more complex than a simple payoff gone wrong. Their final stop was the church, where they found Mrs. Pierce in the vestry with her ironing board set up, pressing the vicar's surplices with practiced efficiency. Steam rose from her iron. The air was sweet with the scent of lavender water from the blue bottle on the nearby chair. "I was here yesterday afternoon from 3:30 until just after 4, Mrs. Pierce confirmed, smoothing a snowy surplice with satisfaction. "The lavender keeps the damp away and freshens the linen beautifully. I always work in the vestry. The tower stairs make me dizzy. And besides, Mr. Whitmore didn't care for interruptions during practice." Miss Marple examined the stone basin where a damp sponge lay in a saucer, noting the faint lavender scent that clung to it. "Did you hear anything unusual yesterday? Voices, perhaps, or movement on the stairs?" The bells, of course, though they seemed more scattered than usual. And there were voices from the tower, Mr. Whitmore's and others. But then I heard someone on the back stairs, moving quickly, and the door to the passage slammed rather hard. I thought perhaps one of the ringers had left early, though it seemed unlike them to leave during practice. The back door that led to the passage showed fresh scuff marks on the lower jamb, and Miss Marple noted how someone in a hurry might have caught their foot or coat on the frame. The evidence was painting a picture of hasty departure, of plans disrupted and meetings gone awry. As they walked back through the village, Inspector Slack's frustration was evident in his brisk pace and the way he consulted his notes repeatedly. We have Hamilton in the village, we have the money changing hands, we have witnesses placing him near the church at the crucial time. But his alibi puts him back in Bournemouth by evening, and the bank manager saw him leave with Whitmore still alive. Miss Marple paused by the churchyard gate, her eyes moving to the tower where the ropes hung motionless in the still air. I think, Inspector, that we're looking at this backwards. We've been assuming that Arthur Whitmore was the victim of someone else's plan, but what if he was the architect of his own destruction? What if the meeting with Hamilton was not about silencing Arthur, but about something else entirely? She thought of the crushed primrose on the third step, the lavender-scented sponge in the vestry, the grease mark on the rope that would make a grip treacherous. The pattern was there, stubborn as Arthur Whitmore's sense of duty, but it required looking at the evidence from a different angle. Consider this, she continued quietly. Arthur takes Hamilton's money, but not as a bribe, as evidence of guilt. He arranges to meet Hamilton at the church, perhaps promising to return the documents in exchange for a full confession. But someone else knows about the meeting, someone who has their own reasons for wanting both men silenced. The question is not who killed Arthur Whitmore, but who used James Hamilton's visit as cover for murder, and why the real killer needed both men out of the way. The wind stirred the primroses along the churchyard path, and Miss Marple felt the familiar certainty that came when scattered threads began to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. The truth was there, hidden in the small details that everyone else had overlooked, waiting for someone patient enough to follow each thread to its proper place in the design. The morning after their revelations about James Hamilton's true purpose brought Miss Marple back to the bell tower, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most important clues often hid in plain sight. Inspector Slack accompanied her, his notebook at the ready, though his expression suggested a man still wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that his simple accident had transformed into something far more complex. The tower held the morning light differently now, casting shadows that revealed details previously overlooked. Miss Marple examined the sabotaged rope with renewed attention, her fingers tracing the hemp fibers until she found what she had suspected. A small tear just above the sally, as if something sharp had caught and pulled. But more significant was the substance that had made the rope treacherous. "Not tallow," she murmured, touching the residue with a clean handkerchief. The scent that rose was medicinal, sharp with the distinctive smell of wintergreen. Dr. Haydock would recognize this immediately. Wintergreen liniment, the sort prescribed for joint pain. A few drops rubbed into hemp would make it nearly impossible to maintain a proper grip. Inspector Slack made careful notes as Miss Marple continued her examination. The arrangement of the other ropes showed subtle alterations that would confuse an experienced ringer in the dim light. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the bells and Arthur Whitmore's precise habits had orchestrated this carefully planned accident. Their investigation took on new urgency when they discovered Arthur's hidden correspondence in his cottage study. Among his papers lay materials from the ancient society of college youths in London, pamphlets describing how change-ringing sequences had been used during wartime to transmit coded messages. Arthur's careful annotations showed he had been preparing to send someone a message through the bells themselves, using patterns that would appear to be ordinary practice to casual observers. He wasn't simply meeting Hamilton to exchange money for silence, Miss Marple realized. studying Arthur's meticulous work. He was preparing to expose a wider network of wartime corruption, using the church bells as his medium of communication. Someone discovered his plan and acted to prevent the transmission. When they returned to question the witnesses with this new understanding, Elsie Banbury provided the crucial detail that had been overlooked in yesterday's confusion. Under gentle but persistent questioning, she revealed that the figure she had seen leaving the ringing chamber had not been wearing Hamilton's distinctive navy coat with brass buttons. It was a dark coat, Inspector, but heavier fabric, more like tweed, Elsie said, her voice gaining confidence as the memory clarified. And it seemed too large for them, as if it didn't quite fit properly. They wore a cap pulled low, and they were favoring one leg slightly, not quite limping, but moving carefully. And the smell. She paused, searching for the right words. Not lavender like the gentleman from London, but musty, like old wood and damp earth. This description painted an entirely different picture from the well-dressed James Hamilton. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring that came when scattered pieces began to form a recognizable pattern. The killer was not the London businessman, but someone local. Someone who knew the church intimately and could move through it without attracting attention. Mrs. Pierce, when questioned about her activities in the vestry, admitted to a brief absence that she had not mentioned previously. "I stepped out to fetch more water for my iron from the tap by the church door," she said, her hands working nervously at her apron. "Only for a moment or two. When I returned, the back passage door was ajar, and there was a black smudge on the frame, like charcoal or chalk dust." The pieces were falling into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed puzzle. Someone had been in the tower during Arthur's meeting with Hamilton, someone who understood the significance of the coded bell sequences and was desperate enough to kill rather than allow their transmission. They had sabotaged the rope with wintergreen liniment, waited for the opportune moment, then fled via the back stairs while the other ringers discovered Arthur's body. Miss Marple stood quietly in the tower, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked through the implications. The pattern was becoming clear. Arthur Whitmore had died, not because he was blackmailing James Hamilton, but because he was preparing to expose others whose wartime crimes had been carefully hidden beneath layers of respectability and village life. "The killer made one crucial mistake," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that Inspector Slack had learned to respect. "They assumed we would focus on the obvious suspect, the London gentleman with his suspicious cash payments and nervous manner. But murder, unlike knitting, reveals its pattern through the smallest stitches. The wintergreen liniment, the figure in ill-fitting tweed, the intimate knowledge of bell ringing required for such precise sabotage. These details point not to a stranger, but to someone we have already met." The wind stirred through the tower, setting the ropes to a gentle sway, and Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction that came when a complex mystery began to reveal its solution. The truth lay hidden among the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead, waiting for someone patient enough to follow each thread to its proper place in the deadly design that had claimed Arthur Whitmore's life. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with the decisive snap of a man ready to make an arrest, but Miss Marple's gentle touch on his arm suggested that the final revelation would require one more careful gathering of all the threads before the pattern could be displayed in its complete and damning clarity. The morning after, their revelations about James Hamilton's true purpose brought Miss Marple back to Dr. Haydock's surgery with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most important clues often hid in the smallest details. Inspector Slack accompanied her, his notebook at the ready, though his expression suggested a man still wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that his simple accident had transformed into something far more complex. The wintergreen liniment discovery had opened a new avenue of investigation that required the careful attention of someone who knew every ache and pain in St. Mary Mead. Dr. Haydock received them in his consulting room with his usual dry competence, though his eyes sharpened when Miss Marple produced the handkerchief bearing the faint medicinal residue. He examined it with professional thoroughness, holding it to the light and testing the scent with the practiced attention of someone who had prescribed countless remedies over the years. Wintergreen liniment, without question, he confirmed, setting the handkerchief aside with careful precision. My own compound, oil of wintergreen with camphor and turpentine. Excellent for joint pain and muscle stiffness, though not many request it these days. Most prefer the modern preparations from the chemist. He consulted his prescription ledger with the methodical care of someone whose records had always been impeccable. I have perhaps 3 regular patients who use it consistently. Mrs. Clement at the vicarage takes it for her arthritis, though she prefers lavender water for most ailments. Tom Pritchard uses it occasionally for his baker's back. All that lifting takes its toll on a man's spine. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their steady rhythm as Dr. Haydock continued his review. But the most regular user would be Harry Coombs. Old shrapnel wound in his left calf from the war troubles him whenever the weather turns damp. He was in just 2 days ago for a fresh bottle, mentioned he might be doing stairs again and wanted to be prepared for the discomfort. The phrase hung in the air with particular significance, and Inspector Slack made careful notes while Miss Marple considered the implications. Harry Coombs, the quiet carpenter who helped with church maintenance, who had been present at the bell practice but claimed to have remained in the porch, who would know every entrance and exit of the ancient building with the intimate familiarity of someone who had repaired its aging timbers for years. Their investigation led them to the sawmill on the village outskirts, where the familiar scent of cut timber and wood shavings filled the air with the honest smell of craftsmanship. Harry was at his workbench, plane in hand, sending curls of pale wood spiraling to the floor with the practiced efficiency of decades. He looked up at their approach with the careful wariness of someone who had been expecting unwelcome visitors, his cap pulled low over eyes that seemed older than his years. Miss Marple observed him with the gentle attention she might give to a nervous bird, noting the way he favored his left leg when he shifted his weight, the chalk dust that lingered on his sleeve despite his careful brushing, the small tear in his tweed coat where a nail or splinter had caught the fabric. Most telling was the faint medicinal scent that clung to him. Not the harsh chemical smell of modern preparations, but the distinctive wintergreen that marked Dr. Haydock's traditional remedy. "Good afternoon, Harry," she said with the comfortable familiarity of village acquaintance. "Such a dreadful business about poor Mr. Whitmore. I do hope the church stairs are quite safe. They looked so worn when I was there yesterday, all smooth in the middle from centuries of feet." Harry's hands stilled on his plane and something flickered behind his eyes. "They're old steps, Miss Marple. Arthur managed them well enough, though." "Oh, I'm sure he did. Such a careful man. So particular about everything." Miss Marple's voice carried the gentle concern of someone genuinely worried about safety. "You knew him well, I think. You helped with the bell ringing when they were short of hands." "Some," Harry admitted, his voice carefully neutral. "He didn't much care for my timing. Said my hand was heavy on the ropes." Miss Marple's eyes moved as if by accident to his hands. Capable carpenter's hands with nails bitten short and rimmed with the fine dust that comes from working old wood. The cuff of his coat showed a pale smear that might have been chalk, and below, his boot bore a fresh scuff that had cut through the leather, the sort that comes from catching the edge of a door frame in haste. "You're very kind to help with the church maintenance," she observed, as if admiring a charitable act, "and thoughtful to bring flowers when the occasion calls for it. I noticed some lovely primroses by the path yesterday." Harry's head came up sharply, wariness sharpening into something approaching alarm. "Who said I brought primroses?" "Oh, no one at all," Miss Marple replied with perfect truthfulness. "Only one notices such things on boots, you know. Our hedgerows leave little tokens when we brush against them. I do like to know where I might safely place my feet, being unsteady as I am." The silence stretched between them, filled only with the distant sound of wind in the trees and the faint creaking of the mill wheel. Harry's laugh, when it came, was a little too loud, a little too forced. "You see everything, Miss Marple. I was only in the porch yesterday, like I told the inspector." "Of course you were," she agreed mildly, though Mrs. Pierce mentioned someone using the back passage during practice. She thought she heard the door slam rather hard. The bells do confuse the senses, don't they? So much noise that one can scarcely hear one's own thoughts. Harry's composure began to crack like ice under spring sun. His hands gripped the plane until his knuckles showed white, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its careful neutrality. "I didn't mean for him to fall so far," he said quietly, the words coming out in a rush as if they had been held back too long. "I only wanted him to slip. Maybe break an arm. Give me time to think. The winter green on the rope. I thought it would just make his grip uncertain." Arthur was always so sure of himself, so confident on those stairs. Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision, her expression gentle but unwavering. "You were afraid of what he might reveal, weren't you, Harry? About the war, about the supply depot, about the things that happened when ordinary people were forced to make impossible choices." The confession that followed painted a picture of wartime, desperation and moral compromise that had haunted several lives for nearly a decade. Harry had been one of the local men recruited to help with supply movements at the depot where Arthur Whitmore served as quartermaster sergeant. When Major Hamilton, now the respectable James Hamilton, had approached him about diverting certain shipments, Harry had agreed not from greed but from necessity. His wife was ill, his children were hungry, and the extra money had meant the difference between survival and destitution. "Arthur knew," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He kept records of everything, but he never said anything then. I thought he'd forgotten, thought we were all safe. But when he started talking about coded messages through the bells, about exposing the truth, I knew he meant to ruin us all. Not just Hamilton with his fancy business, but ordinary folk like me who'd made bad choices when there were no good ones left. The borrowed parish coat had been his disguise, taken from the vestry where it hung forgotten on its peg, too large for anyone but useful for concealing identity. He had waited until Arthur was alone with Hamilton, had slipped up the back stairs while Mrs. Pierce was busy with her ironing, had applied the wintergreen liniment to the rope where Arthur's practiced hand would naturally fall. "I didn't push him," Harry insisted, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I just made the rope treacherous, thought he'd slip and be shaken enough to listen to reason. But when his hand slid off that sally, when he tried to catch himself and couldn't—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence that described Arthur Whitmore's final, fatal fall. Inspector Slack had been writing steadily throughout the confession, but Miss Marple's attention was caught by something deeper than the mere mechanics of crime. She saw in Harry's face the weight of years spent carrying guilt, the terrible arithmetic of survival that war had forced on so many ordinary people, the way small compromises could grow into larger ones until a decent man found himself capable of actions he would never have imagined in peacetime. "Fear makes us do things we never thought possible," she said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle wisdom of someone who had seen enough of human nature to understand its complexities. "But murder, Harry, even unintended murder, cannot be justified by fear of exposure. Arthur Whitmore died because he chose honesty over comfortable silence, and that choice, however inconvenient for others, was his right to make." The wind stirred through the sawmill, setting the high branches to creaking and sending a scatter of wood shavings dancing across the floor. Harry sat with his head in his hands, the weight of confession finally lifting from his shoulders, even as the weight of consequences settled in its place. Miss Marple folded her knitting with the careful attention of someone completing a difficult pattern, every stitch now in its proper place, the design finally clear in all its tragic complexity. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with the decisive snap of a case finally solved, but Miss Marple's gentle expression suggested that understanding human frailty was often more important than simply identifying guilt. The truth was known now, justice would follow its course, but the real tragedy lay not in Harry's crime, but in the long chain of circumstances that had led a decent man to believe that murder was his only choice. The confession that had spilled from Harry Coombs like water from a broken dam left Inspector Slack with the satisfaction of a case solved, but Miss Marple with the deeper unease that came when pieces of a puzzle seemed to fit too neatly. As they walked back through the village after Harry's arrest, she found herself turning over the details with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most obvious solution was not always the complete one. The evidence against Harry was clear and his confession detailed, yet something nagged at Miss Marple's orderly mind, like a dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect pattern. Harry had sabotaged the rope with wintergreen liniment and fled when Arthur fell, but the timing troubled her. Arthur's watch had stopped at 8 minutes to 4, yet Mrs. Pierce had heard the back passage door slam well before that time. If Harry had fled immediately after applying the liniment, who had been in the tower when Arthur actually fell? Inspector Slack, buoyed by the resolution of what he considered a straightforward case, was preparing to close his investigation when Miss Marple suggested they conduct one final examination of the church. The afternoon light fell differently now, casting shadows that revealed details previously overlooked, and she moved through the familiar spaces with the careful attention of someone reading a story written in small, easily missed details. In the vestry, where Mrs. Pierce had been pressing linens with her lavender-scented water, Miss Marple's eyes fell upon the umbrella stand in the corner. Among the familiar collection of parish umbrellas and walking sticks stood one that seemed oddly out of place, a glossy black cane with an ivory knob that bore the unmistakable elegance of London craftsmanship. The ivory showed a small nick on one side, and when Miss Marple examined it more closely in the window light, she noticed a brownish stain that had crept into the damaged surface. "Mrs. Pierce," she said gently, "this walking stick, was it here yesterday during practice?" Mrs. Pierce glanced over from her folding. "I noticed it after all the commotion, Miss Marple. Thought perhaps the vicar had had a visitor, though it seemed too fine for anyone local. Mr. Whitmore never carried a stick, and none of the ringers would leave such a thing behind." Miss Marple lifted the cane, feeling its satisfying weight and noting the faint scent of lavender that clung to the handle. Not the homely lavender of Mrs. Pierce's ironing water, but something more refined, more expensive. She took a hairpin from beneath her hat and carefully scraped at the brownish stain in the ivory nick. The tiny sample that came away had the unmistakable appearance of dried blood. Dr. Haydock, summoned by a message carried by one of the village children, arrived with his usual brisk efficiency and examined the cane with professional thoroughness. "Blood, certainly," he confirmed, studying the sample under his magnifying glass. "Not much, but enough to suggest contact with a wound. The nick in the ivory would create a sharp edge, quite capable of breaking skin." Miss Marple stood at the foot of the tower stairs, holding the cane and considering the angles with the careful precision of someone reconstructing a crime. When she positioned the ivory knob at the height where Arthur's head injury had occurred, the curved surface matched the shape of the bruise Dr. Haydock had described. But more significantly, the angle suggested a blow delivered face to face, not the result of a fall down stone steps. "I believe," she said quietly, "that Mr. Hamilton left more behind than his walking stick. Harry's sabotage of the rope created the opportunity, but someone else delivered the fatal blow. Arthur Whitmore was struck with this cane during his meeting with James Hamilton, and the fall down the stairs was the result, not the cause, of his death." Inspector Slack's satisfaction evaporated as quickly as morning mist. "You're saying Hamilton killed him?" "But the man was back in Bournemouth by evening. We confirmed that." "Oh, I'm quite sure he was," Miss Marple agreed. "But not before he had his confrontation with Arthur in the tower. Consider the evidence, Inspector. The lavender scent that lingered in the tower. The same expensive cologne that clung to Hamilton's room at the Blue Boar. The chalk figures wiped from the blackboard with a damp sponge that bore traces of that same lavender. Someone took time to clean away evidence of their meeting, to remove any record of what Arthur had been trying to communicate through his coded bell sequences. The pieces fell into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed timepiece. Hamilton had arrived for his meeting with Arthur as planned, but the encounter had gone badly wrong. Perhaps Arthur had demanded more than Hamilton was willing to give, or perhaps Hamilton had realized that the bell ringer's coded sequences would expose far more than just his own wartime crimes. In a moment of panic or rage, he had struck Arthur with his walking stick, and the already weakened rope, sabotaged by Harry's wintergreen liniment, had failed to support Arthur's weight as he staggered backward. Two crimes, then, Dr. Haydock observed, his clinical mind parsing the sequence of events. Harry's sabotage created the conditions, but Hamilton's blow was the immediate cause of death. If the rope had held properly, Arthur might have survived the confrontation with nothing more than a bruised head. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked through the final implications. Hamilton wiped the blackboard to remove any evidence of Arthur's coded message, used Mrs. Pierce's lavender-scented sponge to clean away traces of their argument, and departed in haste, forgetting his walking stick in his panic. He was back in Bournemouth by evening, establishing his alibi, while poor Arthur lay dead at the foot of the stairs, and Harry believed his rope sabotage alone was responsible for the tragedy. The wind stirred through the tower, setting the ropes to their gentle sway, and Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony of the situation. Harry Coombs would spend the rest of his life believing himself a murderer, when in fact his actions had merely provided the opportunity for someone else's crime. James Hamilton, the successful businessman with his charitable works and respectable reputation, had killed to protect secrets that were already threatening to destroy him, leaving his walking stick behind like a calling card for those patient enough to notice what others had overlooked. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with the grim satisfaction of a man who had solved a more complex puzzle than he had initially imagined. "We'll need to bring Hamilton back from Bournemouth," he said. "The cane will be evidence enough, along with the blood and the timing. 2 men, 2 crimes, 1 victim." Miss Marple folded her knitting with the careful attention of someone completing a difficult pattern, every stitch now in its proper place, the design finally clear in all its tragic complexity. Arthur Whitmore had died, not because of one man's fear or another's greed, but because of the deadly convergence of past sins and present desperation, played out in the shadow of the bells that would never ring his coded message of truth and justice. The morning after the discovery of the ivory-handled walking stick brought James Hamilton back to St. Mary Mead in a hired motor car, with 2 plainclothes officers, and the village watched his arrival with the sober curiosity reserved for funerals and momentous occasions. He stepped from the vehicle with the practiced composure of a man accustomed to boardrooms and charitable committees, his navy coat immaculate save for the single missing button that left a faint nest of threads where brass had once gleamed. The lavender cologne that surrounded him was not the village's homely ironing water, but the discreet, expensive fragrance that had lingered in the tower and betrayed his presence to those patient enough to notice such details. Inspector Slack, substantial behind the vicar's desk in the vestry that had been converted into a temporary interview room, began with a methodical presentation of evidence that had become his specialty. The walking stick lay before them like an accusation made manifest, its ivory knob bearing the telltale nick that had collected Arthur Whitmore's blood. Hamilton's solicitor, summoned from London with impressive speed, maintained the polished efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises for wealthy clients, but his initial confidence wavered as the evidence mounted with inexorable logic. "Mr. Hamilton," Inspector Slack began, consulting his notes with practiced precision, "you were observed at the bank yesterday afternoon, waiting while Mr. Whitmore deposited £500 in cash. You took lodging at the Blue Boar under the name Jenkins, paying in cash and leaving a monogrammed handkerchief behind. Your walking stick was found in the church vestry, bearing traces of blood that matched the wound on Mr. Whitmore's head. The ivory handle shows a fresh nick that corresponds exactly to the shape and angle of his injury. Hamilton listened with the careful attention of someone who had spent years learning to control his responses under pressure, but Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window with her knitting lying pale and orderly in her lap, observed the telltale signs of strain beneath his polished exterior. His hands worked at his gloves with unconscious agitation, and his eyes moved constantly to the walking stick, as if drawn by magnetic force. "I did visit St. Mary Mead yesterday," Hamilton admitted when the silence stretched too long, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone choosing each word with care. "Mr. Whitmore had written to me regarding certain wartime matters. He suggested we might reach a mutually beneficial arrangement concerning some documents in his possession. I met him at the church as requested. We concluded our business, and I returned to Bournemouth. I have witnesses who can confirm my presence at my club by 6 o'clock. Yet you left your walking stick behind," Inspector Slack observed, his pencil poised over his notebook. "A rather expensive piece, with your blood on the ivory handle. Curious thing to forget if the meeting was as cordial as you suggest." Hamilton's composure flickered for just a moment, long enough for Miss Marple to glimpse the desperation beneath his respectable facade. "I may have set it down during our discussion. The tower stairs are narrow, and I found it easier to manage without encumbrance. As for blood, I cut my finger on the rough stone. Ancient buildings are hardly designed for modern convenience." Dr. Haydock's testimony proved more damaging than Hamilton's carefully crafted explanations could withstand. The doctor's clinical precision left little room for alternative interpretations as he described the angle of impact, the force required to create such a wound, and the way the nick in the ivory handle matched Arthur Whitmore's head injury with mathematical exactness. "The deceased was struck while standing facing his attacker," Dr. Haydock explained with the dispassionate accuracy of medical science. "The blow was delivered with considerable force, consistent with a weapon of this weight and hardness. The subsequent fall down the stairs was the result of incapacitation from the initial injury, not the primary cause of death." Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the mounting tension like a blade through silk. "The lavender scent lingered in the tower long after your departure, Mr. Hamilton. Mrs. Pierce noticed it on the sponge that had been used to wipe the blackboard clean, the same expensive cologne that clung to your room at the Blue Boar. One might wonder what could have required such an extended visit if the meeting was merely a brief exchange of documents for money." The carefully constructed mask finally cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath the successful businessman's facade. Hamilton's hands stilled on his gloves, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent carrying an unbearable secret. "You don't understand what he was threatening," Hamilton said, his composure abandoning him like water through a broken dam. "Whitmore wasn't content with the money. He wanted confession, public acknowledgement, reparations to families affected by the thefts. He had it all worked out. The bell sequences that would transmit his accusations, the documentation that would destroy not just me but dozens of others who had simply tried to survive an impossible situation." The confession that followed painted a picture of wartime desperation and moral compromise that went far beyond simple greed. Hamilton described the supply depot as a place where normal rules had ceased to apply, where officers and enlisted men alike had been forced to choose between duty and survival. The systematic thefts had begun as small diversions to feed hungry families, but had grown into a complex network that enriched some while leaving others to face shortages that cost lives. Arthur was going to expose everything, Hamilton continued, his voice breaking with the strain of finally speaking the truth. Not just the thefts, but the cover-up afterward, the way we'd all agreed to keep silent to protect ourselves. He'd found records of supply shortages that led to casualties, medical supplies that never reached field hospitals, ammunition that wasn't available when units needed it most. He wasn't just threatening our reputations. He was threatening to reveal that our actions had cost lives. Miss Marple listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that confession, like careful knitting, revealed its pattern through attention to every detail. Hamilton's account of the confrontation in the tower matched the physical evidence perfectly. The argument that had grown heated, Arthur's stubborn refusal to accept money in exchange for silence, the moment of rage when Hamilton had struck out with his walking stick. "I didn't know about the rope," Hamilton insisted, as if this detail might somehow mitigate his guilt. "When I struck him, he staggered backward and reached for the rope to steady himself. It gave way beneath his weight and he fell. I thought he'd simply lost his footing after I struck him. It was only later that I learned someone else had been in the tower, someone else who had his own reasons for wanting Arthur silenced." The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on any of them. Two men had entered the tower that day with murder in their hearts: Harry Coombs with his wintergreen liniment and desperate fear, James Hamilton with his expensive cologne and ivory-handled cane. Each had believed himself to be Arthur's only enemy, unaware that their separate crimes would combine to ensure the bell ringer's death. News of Hamilton's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed of wildfire, consuming the village's comfortable assumptions about respectability and justice. The idea that a pillar of society, a man honored for his charitable works, could be capable of such desperate violence was deeply unsettling. It fractured their orderly world where good people were clearly good and villains wore their villainy plainly. Mrs. Dane at the post office found herself defending the very man she had helped to incriminate. "But he sent such a generous donation to the church roof fund," she protested to anyone who would listen. "Such a well-spoken gentleman. It must be some terrible mistake." Her words were echoed throughout the village, in the baker's shop, at the greengrocer's, and in hushed conversations over garden fences. Miss Marple, understanding the village's difficulty in accepting this revelation, made a point of visiting Harry Coombs before his transfer to more permanent custody. She found him in the small holding cell, staring through the barred window with an expression that mixed shame with something approaching relief. "They told me about the cane, about Hamilton," Harry said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "So it wasn't just me then. I thought I'd killed him outright, that I was a murderer. But he was already hurt, wasn't he? Struck before he even got to the rope." "Yes, Harry," Miss Marple confirmed gently. "Mr. Whitmore was struck by Mr. Hamilton's walking stick. The fall was a consequence of that blow. Your sabotage of the rope, while a grave act, did not directly cause his death in the way you feared." A slow, shaky breath escaped him, and for the first time since his confession, Harry's shoulders seemed to lose some of their crushing burden. "I never meant to kill him, Miss Marple. Just to frighten him, to make him see reason. He was going to expose us all, not just Hamilton, but all the little men who did what they had to do to survive the war." As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her garden, pruning roses with careful, unhurried movements. The case of Arthur Whitmore was officially closed now, but the human complexity it had revealed would linger long after the legal proceedings concluded. James Hamilton would face trial for murder, and Harry Coombs would answer for his part in the tragedy, but both would do so with the knowledge that they had not acted alone in their desperation. The bells of St. Mary's hung silent in their tower, holding not just the echo of a man's final fall, but the quiet, persistent whisper of justice painstakingly uncovered. Arthur Whitmore's coded sequences would never be transmitted. His message of truth and accountability had died with him, but the truth itself had found its way to the surface through the smallest, most overlooked details. Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had finally emerged from the scattered threads of evidence, a design that spoke of human frailty and moral compromise, of the way small sins could grow into larger ones until decent people found themselves capable of actions they would never have imagined in better times. The truth was rarely simple, she knew, and justice was often more complex than the law could easily accommodate. But both had been served in their fashion, and perhaps that was the most one could hope for in a world where the past refused to stay buried and the present demanded payment for old debts. The wind stirred through her garden, carrying the faint sound of evening bells from a neighboring parish, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of Arthur Whitmore's stubborn integrity, the quality that had made him dangerous to those who preferred their secrets safely buried. In death, he had achieved what he could not accomplish in life: the exposure of truth and the demand for accountability, even if the price had been higher than anyone could have imagined. The morning after James Hamilton's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar quiet that follows a public shock, when ordinary routines continue but conversations hover at the edge of what cannot be left unsaid. Miss Marple, arranging her breakfast things with particular care, looked up at the soft tap on her window to find Mr. Pierce standing at her gate with his hat in his hands and a brown paper packet clutched under his arm, his face wearing the apologetic solemnity of someone bearing the dead man's final messages. The packet, redirected from Arthur Whitmore's cottage, contained a letter from his sister Margaret in Bournemouth, along with a smaller envelope that Arthur had asked her to post if she heard nothing from him by week's end. Upon reading of his death in the newspapers, Margaret had thought Miss Marple might know best what should be done with her brother's final instructions. The smaller envelope held a card bearing a careful grid of numbers titled Plain Bob Doubles, Practice Sequences, and a slip of paper with 3 sets of initials, followed by psalm numbers and a hymn reference. Miss Marple studied the methodical arrangement with the patient attention she gave to complex knitting patterns. Arthur Whitmore, even in death, had remained true to his precise nature, creating a system that would preserve his evidence should anything happen to him. The cards numbered sequences, corresponded to bell-ringing changes, but the accompanying initials and biblical references suggested a deeper purpose, a coded message that only someone familiar with his methods would understand. At the church, where the morning light fell differently through windows that seemed to remember recent tragedy, Miss Marple found Elsie Banbury polishing the brasses with determined vigor, and Tom Pritchard examining the bell ropes with the careful attention of someone learning to see familiar things in a new light. The blackboard in the ringing chamber, wiped clean after Arthur's final practice, still bore faint impressions when held to the light, ghostly traces of the sequences he had been preparing to transmit. Margaret Whitmore arrived on the afternoon train, a woman of middle years who carried her brother's precision in the set of her shoulders and the careful arrangement of her traveling clothes. She received Miss Marple in the vicarage parlor with the composed dignity of someone who had spent days preparing for this conversation, her hands folded over a leather portfolio that contained the final pieces of Arthur's methodical puzzle. "Arthur wrote to me regularly during the war," Margaret explained, her voice carrying the weight of old sorrows carefully preserved. Not about the fighting, but about the moral compromises he witnessed. He believed someone needed to keep accurate records, to ensure that truth would eventually emerge. The coded sequences were his insurance, a way to preserve the information even if his documents were destroyed or stolen. The portfolio revealed Arthur's true purpose in those final weeks. He had been preparing not just to expose James Hamilton, but to provide evidence to the War Office that would reopen investigations into systematic corruption that had cost lives. The bell sequences were designed to transmit specific information, names, dates, locations, using the mathematical principles of change ringing to encode details that would mean nothing to casual observers, but everything to those who knew how to interpret them. Inspector Slack, summoned from his paperwork with the weary air of a man discovering that solved cases could still sprout complications, examined Arthur's materials with growing comprehension. The precision of the system, the careful cross-references between biblical passages and bell-ringing terminology, painted a picture of a man who had spent months preparing for a single moment of revelation that death had prevented him from achieving. He meant to ring the sequence during regular practice, Margaret explained, consulting her brother's notes with familiar ease. To anyone listening, it would sound like ordinary change ringing. But to those who understood the code, it would provide specific details about the supply depot thefts and their consequences. Arthur believed that justice delayed was not justice denied, merely justice waiting for the proper moment. The tragic irony was not lost on Miss Marple. Arthur had died trying to transmit his message of accountability, but his death had accomplished what his life could not. The investigation into his murder had exposed the corruption network more thoroughly than any coded Bell sequence, bringing to light the very information he had died trying to preserve. Yet his systematic approach had ensured that even death could not silence his testimony entirely. As the legal proceedings unfolded in the weeks that followed, the village struggled to reconcile the respectable facade of James Hamilton with the desperate killer who had struck down Arthur Whitmore in the church tower. The newspapers seized upon the story with voracious appetite, transforming the quiet parish into a temporary circus of reporters and curiosity seekers who arrived on morning trains with notebooks and cameras, seeking sensational details to feed the public's hunger for scandal. Miss Marple observed this invasion with patient resignation, declining interviews and publishers' offers with polite firmness. She had no desire to see Arthur Whitmore's death transformed into entertainment, or to profit from the human tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The truth had been served. Justice would follow its measured course, and the village would eventually heal from the wounds that exposure had opened. The trial revealed the full extent of the wartime corruption, implicating dozens of others who had participated in or benefited from the systematic theft of military supplies. James Hamilton, represented by expensive London counsel, maintained his dignity even as the evidence mounted against him, his story of self-defense crumbling under the weight of physical evidence and witness testimony. Harry Coombs, less ably defended but bearing the lighter burden of sabotage rather than murder, faced his sentence with the relief of a man who had finally shed the crushing weight of believing himself a killer. Dr. Haydock, testifying with his usual clinical precision, seemed older after the proceedings, as if the weight of human frailty revealed in the courtroom had pressed more heavily upon his shoulders. The village doctor had seen much suffering in his career, but there was something particularly troubling about violence that arose from respectability, corrupted, about the way fear could drive decent men to unthinkable acts. Margaret Whitmore remained in the village for several weeks after the trial, tending her brother's grave with the same methodical care he had brought to his bell ringing. She planted primroses around the simple headstone, not wild ones from the hedgerows, but cultivated specimens that spoke of deliberate remembrance. Miss Marple often encountered her there in the late afternoons, and their conversations revealed Arthur as a more complex figure than his stern reputation had suggested. A man haunted by knowledge of corruption, but determined to preserve the evidence that might someday bring justice. The church bells remained silent for months after the tragedy, their ropes hanging motionless in the tower where Arthur had fallen. When practice finally resumed under new leadership, the enthusiasm seemed muted, marked by a solemnity that acknowledged the price of truth and the weight of secrets finally revealed. Elsie Banbury never returned to the ropes, claiming the sound made her nervous, while Tom Pritchard continued with subdued dedication that suggested duty rather than joy. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the lessons the case had taught about the complexity of human nature and the way past actions could reach forward to claim their due. Arthur Whitmore had been a good man driven by inflexible integrity. James Hamilton, a respectable citizen corrupted by fear and greed. Harry Coombs, a decent person, pushed beyond his moral limits by desperation. Each had made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but had led inexorably to tragedy. The case had also demonstrated the importance of paying attention to small details. The wintergreen scent that revealed one crime, the lavender cologne that exposed another, the brass button that provided the first thread leading to truth. Miss Marple's knitting bag contained a new project now, a complex pattern that required careful attention to every stitch, and she found comfort in the methodical work of creating something beautiful from individual threads. The bells of St. Mary's eventually resumed their changes across the village, marking hours and calling the faithful to worship as they had for centuries. But those who listened carefully might have detected a different quality in their voice now, a note of solemnity that acknowledged the price of truth and the weight of justice finally served. Arthur Whitmore's message had been transmitted after all, not through coded sequences, but through the patient unraveling of secrets that had bound good men to silence for too long. Walking through the village on a crisp October morning, Miss Marple paused at the churchyard gate to listen to the familiar sound of the bells and think of the complex pattern they had helped to reveal. Truth, like good knitting, required patience and attention to detail, but the finished product justified the careful work required to create it. The case of Arthur Whitmore was closed now, but its lessons would linger in the village memory, a reminder that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its way to the surface through the smallest and most overlooked details. The primroses around Arthur's grave had taken root and would return each spring, a living testament to the stubborn persistence of truth and the enduring power of one man's refusal to let corruption remain hidden. In death, Arthur Whitmore had achieved what his life could not: the exposure of secrets that had festered in darkness for too long, and the restoration of accountability to a world that had forgotten the importance of keeping accurate records of right and wrong. The first frost of winter arrived with the verdict, laying its crystalline judgment across St. Mary Mead as if nature itself were drawing a line beneath the tragic events that had shattered the village's peaceful routine. Miss Marple, arranging her breakfast things with particular care, looked up from her morning correspondence to find Inspector Slack at her gate, his official bearing softened by something approaching personal satisfaction. The legal proceedings had concluded with the measured finality that justice required, though not without the complex moral calculations that had characterized the entire case. James Hamilton, his carefully constructed facade of respectability finally stripped away, had been convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. His expensive London counsel had successfully argued that the fatal blow to Arthur's head, while inexcusable, had been delivered in the heat of desperate argument rather than with premeditated intent. The sentence of 12 years reflected both the severity of his crime and the recognition that fear, not malice, had ultimately driven him to violence. Harry Coombs, whose wintergreen sabotaged robe had created the conditions for tragedy, received 18 months for criminal mischief, a penalty that acknowledged his role while recognizing that he had never intended Arthur's death. Hamilton's business in Bournemouth has been wound up entirely, Inspector Slack reported, settling against her garden fence with the comfortable familiarity of shared experience. Assets seized to compensate families affected by the wartime thefts. The War Office investigation he was so desperate to prevent has been reopened using Whitmore's meticulous records. Seems the bell ringer's message got transmitted after all, just not the way he planned. Miss Marple continued her careful work among the frost-touched primroses, their pale faces turning toward the weak winter sun with the same stubborn persistence that had characterized their namesake in life. Arthur Whitmore's integrity had indeed taken root in death, spreading through official channels and newspaper accounts to expose corruption that had festered in darkness for nearly a decade. The village itself had weathered the storm of publicity with characteristic resilience, though the experience had left subtle changes in its social fabric. Mrs. Dane at the post office now checked credentials more carefully before providing information about local residents. The Blue Boar had installed a proper guest register system, abandoning the casual arrangements that had allowed Hamilton to lodge under false pretenses. Even the church had implemented new security measures with proper locks on the tower door and a sign-in system for bell ringers. Margaret Whitmore had remained in the village through the autumn, overseeing not only her brother's modest estate, but ensuring his carefully preserved evidence reached the proper authorities. She had established a small trust fund from Arthur's savings, augmented by compensation from Hamilton's seized assets, to maintain the church bells and support their restoration. There was poetic justice in using the proceeds of corruption to fund the very instrument Arthur had planned to use for its exposure. As the first anniversary of Arthur's death approached, the village prepared for a memorial service that would celebrate his contributions while acknowledging the complex circumstances of his passing. Miss Marple had been asked to speak, a request she had accepted with characteristic humility despite her central role in uncovering the truth. The memorial service drew visitors from beyond St. Mary Mead, including several families affected by the wartime thefts that Arthur's evidence had finally brought to light. Their presence transformed the occasion from simple remembrance into something approaching reconciliation, as long-delayed acknowledgement of decades-old wrongs provided a measure of closure for wounds that had never properly healed. The bells themselves provided the most fitting tribute. Under Tom Pritchard's careful guidance, the ringers performed a memorial peal using the coded sequences from Arthur's final practice card. To most listeners, it sounded like ordinary change ringing, but those who understood the mathematical precision heard something deeper, a quiet assertion of truth woven through the changes. The psalm Arthur had marked twice in his notes, finally finding its voice. Mercy and truth are met together. Elsie Banbury, who had abandoned the ropes but found her calling in church flower arranging, had created a simple display of primroses around Arthur's grave. The brass plaque, funded by Margaret's Trust, bore an inscription that captured the essence of his character. Arthur Whitmore, bell ringer and keeper of truth, who believed that justice delayed is not justice denied. Margaret herself had taken a position with the Historical Research Society, dedicating herself to uncovering similar wartime injustices. Her final letter to Miss Marple contained a pressed primrose from Arthur's grave, and gratitude not just for solving the mystery of her brother's death, but for understanding the depth of his purpose. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the completed pattern the case had finally revealed. Standing in her garden as evening approached, she listened to the practice bells from the neighboring parish and thought of the small details that had guided her through the labyrinthine mystery. The scattered primrose on the stair, the wintergreen scent, the stopped watch, the missing brass button, the lingering lavender cologne. These seemingly insignificant clues, woven together with patience and understanding of human nature, had ultimately revealed the full, tragic design. The case had demonstrated that truth, like properly executed bell changes, followed immutable laws that could not be corrupted by human weakness or compromised by expedient arrangements. Arthur Whitmore had died because he refused to let sleeping dogs lie. But his death had accomplished what his life could not: the exposure of corruption and the restoration of accountability to a system that had forgotten its moral foundations. Walking home through the familiar lanes as the first stars appeared, Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction that came when a complex mystery revealed its solution. The truth was rarely simple, and justice was often more complex than the law could easily accommodate, but both had been served in their fashion. The bells of St. Mary's continued their changes as darkness fell, their mathematical precision a testament to the enduring power of order in a chaotic world, and to the memory of a man who had died rather than compromise his commitment to truth. In their clear, resonant voices, Miss Marple heard not just the marking of time, but the persistent whisper of justice finally, properly served.